Hi, pastors. Well, today's going to seem like that we've already covered it. Today we're going to go back and we're going to be looking at the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And what we're going to find in them is they do not carry on the story. We've seen 1st Samuel, 2nd Samuel, 1st Kings, 2nd Kings, and now 1st and 2nd Chronicles go backwards and reach back into history. And they are going to provide us a second perspective on the same history that we've read about in Samuel and Kings. So it should be no surprise that when we think about 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it includes the kingdom, the great time of David and Solomon's reigns. It also includes the division that follows Solomon as the kingdom splits between Jeroboam and Rehoboam, the north and the south. First and Second Chronicles also captured the revival kings, especially, and First and Second Chronicles carries us to the exile. But as we're going to see in a moment, it doesn't leave us. First and Second Kings leave us here. First and Second Chronicles are going to take us one step further, one hopeful step. So when we think about what's the unique difference between 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we find in Chronicles a priestly editorial, a priestly perspective on King David and on Judah's reforming kings. Whereas the books of 1st and 2nd Kings covered all of the kings in the north and the south, 1st and 2nd Chronicles comes back and focuses only on those that meets the writer's purpose. And we're going to see that purpose in just a moment. When we think about the difference between Chronicles and Kings, I want you to picture on this side the books of Kings and here the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, much war. There's a lot of battles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, very few. The focus on 1st Kings, more on politics, less on politics in the Chronicles. On this side, every king is discussed, no matter how minor. In 1st and 2nd Chronicles, only David's line and only those that are focused on reforming the country are really emphasized. When we come to the end of 2nd Kings, it's very hopeless. We see the end of the northern kingdom and the fall of Samaria, and we see the end of the southern kingdom and Jerusalem in the fall of Jerusalem. But when we come to Chronicles, it carries us one step beyond that to a more hopeful end of the book. So I want to look at the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles in a little bit different way. We're going to actually look at them by starting at the end. I've mentioned twice now there's a hopeful end in 1st and 2nd Chronicles that's not in 2nd Kings. And that end is found in verse 36 of 2nd Chronicles. It is the edict of Cyrus. Cyrus is the king who is holding the nation of Israel, the southern kingdom, captive in Babylon. And it is Cyrus who writes an edict, a command that allows them to return to the land, to restore Jerusalem, and to rebuild the temple. The different perspective between Kings and Chronicles really centers right here. Kings is written from the perspective of being in the exile. It is a writer sitting in the middle of that 70 years of exile and looking back and writing a record to explain how the North and the South ended up in exile. But the writer of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is writing from not the exile period, but the return, when the children of Israel have been able to go home and have the opportunity to rebuild the temple. So this writer reminds us of that edict, the opportunity to return home and restore worship. And he writes from that perspective to encourage those who were going home to rebuild the temple. So now let's take a look at how the book opens. The first 9 chapters are genealogies. It would be easy to skip over those because it's really a lot of people and most of them we don't know. But the purpose of this genealogy, it focuses on the tribe of Judah and it focuses on the tribe of Levi. The reason those are so critical for a nation that's returning home and restoring itself and rebuilding the nation of Judah, that's where the kingly line comes from. It proved that God was faithful to protect the Davidic line and to keep his promise to David. And so it traces the line of Judah because of the kings. And it traces the Levites, the roots of the Levites, because they were the priests. After the temple was rebuilt, who was going to lead them? Who was going to serve? Who was going to offer the sacrifices? It was going to be the priests. And so because they come from the tribe of Levi, those 2 families, it was important that they are traced. Next, we see the focus on the reign of Israel's beloved King David. If we look closely at this record of David and compare it to the record that we have in 2 Samuel, there'll be a striking contrast. This focuses on David's accomplishments. It focuses a positive light on King David. In fact, an easy comparison is to read 2 Samuel 11 and then read 1 Chronicles 20. Both of them describe the battle in which Joab leads the nation instead of David. Joab leads the army and conquers Rabbah. The difference, though, is in 2 Samuel, we have the sad story of David's sin with Bathsheba. In 1 Chronicles, no mention of Bathsheba at all. The sin has been forgiven and is behind. The focus on the portrait of David is on David, who is the model worshiper, who sets the example for those who are rightly devoted to God. And David is the one who received the covenant that God would keep throughout the history of the Chronicles. Next, we see David's son, Solomon. And the focus on Solomon in 2 Chronicles is the rebuilding of the temple. Again, the focus is not on the negative, the failures of Solomon, but the focus on his greatness in rebuilding the temple. Do you see how writing from this perspective of rebuilding the temple the second time, do you see how that explains this emphasis? Kings and priests, Davidic covenant and devoted worshiper, and then the one who built the first temple sets an example for those who are going to be building the second. Chapters 10 through 36 focus on David's dynasty. It really serves 2 purposes. One, it proves and often says that God preserved the Davidic line because of his promise to David. So here they are returning back home under the Edict of Cyrus, and they see the stories of God's protection and the proof of God's protection in the genealogies, and they recognize God's faithfulness in keeping his promises. Also, if we look closely at these stories, the focus on these kings are not just the ones in the south, not just the ones in the Davidic line, but the focus is also on those who revive the nation. It makes sense, doesn't it? If the book is preparing a people who are getting ready to rebuild the temple, why not focus on those kings who valued the temple, who showed how it united the nation, who demonstrated what a powerful impact proper worship in the temple could provide for a people? So we can see the distinct difference between 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Samuel and Kings. Now let's talk about some possible discussion questions. I'm going to introduce a really tricky one for you here, and this is going to be for your discussion. I'm not going to help you with this. compare 2 Samuel 24:1 with 1 Chronicles 21:1, you're going to read two statements that seem to be completely opposite. They both can't be true, and yet Scripture records them both about who incites David to number the people. So the question is, what was God's role and Satan's role in the temptations? And how can we explain the two different accounts? How can two writers look at the same event and say two completely different things about them? I'm going to leave that fun discussion up to you. Our other discussion question focuses in on a very well-known and deeply loved passage in 2 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 7:14. It's the passage that reminds us that if God's people will call on his name and humble themselves, he will heal their land. The question that I would like you to wrestle with is, how does this apply to Uganda? And then how does it apply to our churches? You see, for the nation of Israel, the separation of religion and government did not exist. Religion and government were together. So when the government, the nation, was called on to humble themselves and turn back to God, they would receive spiritual and physical blessings. But from the New Testament into our day, churches and our political government, our political system, are separate. So how do we apply this passage? A great, great promise that goes to a people whose politics and religion were together now comes to us, and we have politics here, and we have our devotion and our ministry and our church here. How does this passage apply to those two? And how do we find and receive those blessings, those great blessings that God promises? Well, I wish I could be there and enjoy the discussion with you, because I'm sure these two questions are going to generate a lot of great thinking. So I pray that you're blessed by it. I pray that it will encourage you and you will encourage each other as you go forward in serving the Lord. See you again soon.